They asked her to stand in court, but not to speak. They let others tell her story, but never her. And when she finally tried to find her voice, they silenced it. This is not a story of protest. It's a story of presence, of a woman who was told to disappear and chose, instead, to be quietly heard. Stay with me as we unfold the silence she never asked for. She sat at the edge of a wooden bench, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor beneath her shoes. The courtroom was old, echoing, soaked in the color of dust and old paper. And the air smelled faintly of ink, old wood, and something else, something heavier. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the high windows, but inside, silence held everyone in its grip. And at the center of that silence was her, a woman, a defendant, but not a voice. Because in that courtroom, she was not allowed to speak. Her name was Eleanor Gray, a widow, 32, a woman of quiet demeanor and observant eyes. In another time, she might have been left alone to tend her garden, to mend her dresses, to write letters in the glow of candlelight. But in the year 1858, in a county courthouse in New England, she was something else entirely. She was a scandal, a spectacle, a woman accused. They said she had defied her landlord, that she had raised her voice in church, that she had disrespected the order of things. But most damning of all, they said she had dared to petition the town council, using her own hand, her own words, to protest an injustice that had cost her home, her belongings, and her dignity. The petition was no more than a page. It had been written in careful cursive, folded once, and placed in the hands of a man in a black coat who had not even looked her in the eye when he tossed it aside. What followed was swift summons, questions, whispers, and finally, this trial. But the trial was never really hers. There were lawyers, of course, men in stiff collars and deliberate voices. There was a judge whose spectacles perched delicately on the end of his nose, who listened with his eyes closed, as though he could measure truth in breath alone. And there were jurors, all male, all silent, their hands clasped like those in a prayer, though no one prayed for her. Eleanor was told to stand. She was told to sit. She was asked nothing. Her lawyer, a kind man, though more nervous than she needed, spoke gently about her hardship, her virtue, her grief. He tried to paint her as innocent, as harmless, as one of many women who had suffered and stayed silent. But he didn't tell them what she wanted to say. No one did. Because the moment Eleanor had tried to speak, the judge had raised his hand. "The defendant will remain quiet," he said, "as per the order of this court." And just like that, her voice was erased. She had prepared words, not many, just enough. She had written them on a scrap of linen, tucked in her pocket. She had stayed awake the night before, memorizing the sound of her own thoughts. "I only wanted to be heard," the first line said. Not pitied, not punished, just heard. But there was no place for that in the room built for men. And so she sat, her body present, her voice dismissed. The gavel came down. It was not a harsh sentence, just a fine, and a quiet suggestion that she should leave town. They called it leniency. But what Eleanor carried home that day was not mercy. It was silence. A silence so full of words it felt heavier than stone. In the months that followed, people forgot the details. They remembered her name only in fragments, like something half-read and folded shut. But Eleanor remembered everything. The sound of the gavel, the weight of her linen scrap still in her pocket, the words she had not been allowed to say. And in the quiet of her small rented room, she began to write them again, not for the court, not for forgiveness, but for herself. Because silence, once forced, becomes something you must answer. Not with anger, not with shouting, but with slow, deliberate remembrance. This is not a story of defiance. It is not a story of victory. It is the story of a woman who wanted to speak and was told not to. And what happens next? When the world turns away from a voice will unfold in the quiet that follows. That quiet is where her story truly begins. The town did not speak of Eleanor Gray after the trial, not because they had nothing to say, but because silence has many shapes, some cold, some sharp, some soft as pity, but all of them distancing. Shopkeepers would nod politely, but lower their eyes. Children would glance and then turn quickly, pulled away by cautious mothers. Even the women who had once exchanged simple pleasantries with her at the baker's now folded their arms a little tighter when she passed. It was not cruelty, it was erasure, the slow kind, like fog swallowing the end of a road. Eleanor did not fight it. She rented a small room above an old cobbler's shop, where the air always smelled of leather and dust, and the windows overlooked a narrow alley that never saw the sun. She moved quietly, bought only what she needed, and spoke as little as possible. At night, she wrote by candlelight, not with the hope of being read, but because the silence of the page was the only place she was still allowed to speak. She kept the linen scrap from the trial, though the ink had faded and the corners had curled. Sometimes she would unfold it, press it flat with the edge of her hand, and whispered the words she had never been allowed to say. I only wanted to be heard. And then, after a pause, she would add to them. Not declarations, not accusations, just memories, feelings, fragments. The stairs creaked like they were holding their breath. He said he would wait, but the door closed. So quietly, I didn't notice he was gone. The woman in the hat at the trial looked like someone who wanted to cry, but forgot how. They were sentences that no longer needed to explain themselves. They just needed to be written. And somehow, in doing so, she began to gather herself. Again, not loudly, not with sudden courage, but piece by piece, like someone sweeping the last light into a room at dusk. She began to walk farther, past the river, to the edges of town. Sometimes she would sit beneath the large tree behind, the abandoned mill, its roots breaking the earth like veins. She liked the quiet there. It was a different quiet than in the courtroom, not hollow, not imposed, just still. One afternoon, while sitting there with her notebook, she heard footsteps. A young girl no more than 12 approached, holding a small cloth bundle of wildflowers. She said nothing at first, only looked at Eleanor with wide, curious eyes. Then, shyly, she extended the bundle. Eleanor took it gently, unsure why the girl had chosen her. But before she could speak, the girl asked, "Did they really not let you talk?" Eleanor blinked. The question caught in her chest. No one had asked her anything since the trial, not even something so simple, so direct. She nodded. The girl sat down beside her, pulling her knees up under her chin. "That's not fair," she said. "Sometimes I'm not allowed to talk. Either Mama says it's not ladylike." Eleanor turned the bundle of flowers in her hands. The petals were uneven, some already bruised, but they were beautiful because they were given. She looked at the girl. "You can talk here," she said softly. The girl smiled, just a small curve of the mouth. Then she began telling a story about a bird she saw once that sang with its wings, but never opened its beak, about how her father laughed in his sleep, about a dream she had where everyone spoke in colors instead of words. Eleanor listened, truly listened, not as someone above, but beside. And in that moment, something opened, not loudly, not grandly, but enough to remind Eleanor that being heard didn't always come from speaking. Sometimes, it came from listening when no one else would. She began returning to the tree more often, and the girl, her name was Clara, would return to, sometimes with drawings, sometimes with stories, sometimes just to sit in silence. Word by word, Eleanor began to mend the invisible tear inside her. The world had not changed. The courtroom still stood. The judge still ruled. The street still whispered. But under the branches of that tree, something gentle bloomed. Not justice, not redemption, but a shared silence that belonged to no one but them. And within it, Eleanor found the beginnings of something she had not felt in years. Not peace, not yet, but possibility. It was on a windless evening in late October that Eleanor began her letter, not to a person, not to a judge or a council or any name carved on a desk in polished mahogany. She addressed it to no one, and yet to everyone, beginning only with the words, "To the one who listens when others don't." She wrote it at the small desk beneath her window, a candle flickering beside her, and a cup of tea, long gone cold. Outside, the alley was quiet, except for the occasional shuffle of a cat, the sigh of dry leaves. Inside, her pen moved slowly, deliberately, not racing toward truth, but brushing up against it, one line at a time. She wrote of what it felt like to be spoken about, but never spoken to. Of watching others twist her story into something sharper, smaller, more convenient. Of standing in a room full of people and feeling more invisible than when she was alone. "There is a particular silence," she wrote, "that grows inside a person when they are not allowed to answer the questions being asked about them." She did not name names. She did not point fingers. Her letter was not an accusation, but an unraveling, a way to lift the weight of unsaid things, to let them float for a while in the safety of ink. She wrote of the courtroom, yes, but not of the verdict. She described the slant of light through the high windows, the way the judge cleared his throat before silencing her, the dust in the air that glittered like tiny suspended judgments. "I remember most the way my mouth felt when I was told to close it," she wrote. "Not angry, not afraid, just wrong, like forgetting your own name and being told it never mattered." The letter grew, page by page, over several nights. She did not rush. Some evenings she added just a line, others nothing at all. But it became her quiet ritual, something to return to, something that reminded her she still had something worth giving voice to, even if it was only on paper. Clara knew nothing about the letter. Eleanor never mentioned it. The girls' visits had grown less frequent as winter crept in, but sometimes she'd leave small sketches tucked beneath the tree drawings of birds, stars, sometimes a single open mouth with no sound. Eleanor always found them. She kept them in a small tin box beside her desk, each one a silent conversation. One day, as snow gathered gently along the windowsill, Eleanor decided the letter was finished. She folded the pages carefully, tied them with twine, and slipped them into a plain envelope. But then she hesitated. To send it would mean choosing someone, trusting someone. She wasn't sure she was ready, so instead, she walked to the library, a small building, quiet and warm, its walls lined with worn books and wooden ladders. She approached the librarian, a young man with kind eyes and a voice softer than most, and asked if he kept a box for anonymous donations. He pointed to a tray near the door. "Old recipes, poems, sermons, people leave them sometimes," he said. "We never throw anything away." Eleanor nodded, placed the envelope in the tray, and turned to leave. She didn't expect it to be read. That wasn't the point. It was enough to know it existed somewhere outside of her own mind, that the words had been let out, that they might be found by someone, someday, who needed them. Back in her room, she lit a candle and sat in silence. The silence was different now, not empty, not forced, but earned. She no longer needed to prove anything. She had spoken in the only way she could, and though her voice had never echoed through a courtroom, it had found a quieter audience, one made of patience, of paper, of possibility. Somewhere, in a wooden box among recipes and prayers, her truth waited, not to shout, not to change the world, but to be heard, even if only by one person. Even if only by someone who needed to remember that silence is not the same as absence, that being silenced is not the same as being gone. And in that space, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in years. Not power, not justice, but presence. Real, gentle, and quietly her own. The envelope sat in the library tray for days, perhaps weeks. No one noticed it at first. People came and went, borrowing books, returning notes, flipping through pamphlets without reading the titles. The tray filled, then emptied, then filled again. And through it all, Eleanor said nothing. She did not wonder who might find it. She did not check. She simply continued her quiet routine, waking early, tending to her small room, walking past the bakery where no one greeted her anymore, stopping sometimes beneath the tree where Clara used to wait. Winter deepened, and the air turned brittle. Her steps grew slower, but there was a lightness to them too, as though some invisible burden had shifted. And then, one morning, everything changed, not dramatically. Not with some grand knocking at her door, but with a single letter slipped beneath it. The envelope was unmarked. Inside was a folded page, handwritten, ink smudged slightly in the corner. It read, "I don't know who you are, but I found your letter. I read every word, twice, and when I finished, I didn't feel alone anymore." Eleanor sat for a long time holding the paper, not moving, her breath shallow. The letter was unsigned. It offered no promises, no questions, no name, only those few lines. But they were enough. She placed the page beside her candle, and when she lit the wick that evening, the flame seemed to dance a little taller. It had been years since Eleanor had received a letter not demanding something of her, and now here it was, a response not to her identity, but to her voice. It awakened something quiet but persistent in her. She began to write more. Not long stories, just short reflections, small truths captured like breath in winter. And once a week, she'd return to the library tray and leave another envelope twine, one tied with the same piece of twine, marked only by a single pressed flower or a small symbol inked in the corner, a leaf, a crescent moon, a wave. She never signed her name, and for a while, nothing came back. But then, slowly, the replies began. One said, "You remind me of my grandmother." Another wrote, "I've never said these things aloud, but somehow reading your words gave me permission." One note had only a poem, hand-scrawled and a little uneven. They told her not to speak, so she learned to echo in the bones of those who did. Eleanor kept each reply in a wooden box. She did not organize them or reread them often. She simply let them be, like a garden planted in darkness, trusting the roots to grow. The town still had no idea who was writing. A few speculated it was the librarian himself. Others thought it was a traveling preacher or an old teacher who never spoke. But no one ever thought of Eleanor, and that was precisely what made it work. In her anonymity, she was free. The words were no longer tied to a face people had judged. They were judged on their own merit, quiet merit, offered gently, never imposed. Clara returned in the spring, taller and a little older, her steps heavier with whatever winter had taught her. She didn't say much at first, just sat beside Eleanor beneath the tree like she used to. Then one day she held out a slip of paper. "I think I want to write, too," she said. Eleanor read the lines, smiled, and nodded. She handed Clara a piece of folded parchment, the kind she used for her own letters, and said simply, "Begin where it hurts the least." From that day on, Clara joined her in the silent ritual. Two women, one younger, one older, both shaped by the world's refusal to hear them, now shaping a quieter world where voices didn't need to be loud to matter. They would sit in silence, write in silence, leave things behind for others to find, not for recognition, not for legacy, but for truth. And truth, Eleanor had come to believe, was not a thunderclap or a courtroom shout. It was the sound of a page being unfolded, the sound of someone exhaling after realizing they are not alone. The world beyond them still moved the same. Men still ruled courtrooms. Judgments were still passed without testimony, but under the branches of an old tree and through a tray in a quiet library. Something else moved, too gently, invisibly, like wind between leaves. Eleanor no longer asked for a voice in the room. She had found one outside of it. Not because she shouted louder, but because she whispered longer. The tray at the library grew heavier with words. What once held recipes and half-written hymns now carried confessions, dreams, and unnamed griefs from voices that had waited far too long to speak. Sometimes Eleanor would walk past the shelves and wonder how many of those notes had been written by hands still trembling. She never stayed long. She didn't need to. The act of leaving was enough. She knew now that silence, when chosen, could be as powerful as speech, but the kind forced upon someone, that silence had to be reshaped, repurposed, turned into something new. Spring unfolded slowly, painting the town in soft greens and muddy paths. Birds returned to the sky, and children to the streets. Eleanor still kept her distance. She was not hated anymore, just forgotten, and she had learned to find comfort in that, until the day a knock came at her door. It wasn't loud, just a firm, respectful rhythm that paused between taps. She opened it cautiously, and there stood a man, tall, gray at the temples, coat buttoned even in mild weather, and eyes that seemed to carry both memory and uncertainty. She knew that face. His name was Edward Talcott, once a town councilman, now just a man with history behind him and questions ahead. He had been one of the men who had dismissed her petition all those years ago. Back then, he had leaned back in his chair, nodded silently as others laughed, and said nothing when she was told to remain silent. Now, he stood before her, hat in hand, visibly older, his voice softer than she remembered. "Miss Gray," he said, "or perhaps I should say simply Eleanor. I hope I haven't intruded." She didn't answer, but she didn't close the door either. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. "I found this in the library tray. It had a leaf on the corner, like the ones I've seen before, and ... I think I recognized the way the words sat on the page." Eleanor said nothing. He glanced down at the letter, then back up at her. "I just wanted to say I remember you. From the courtroom. I remember your eyes, and the way you sat there, silent, not by choice, but by force." His hands shook slightly as he continued. "I thought then that silence meant peace, but now I think it just meant absence, and I've come to regret that absence deeply." There was a long stillness between them, the kind that holds the weight of old choices. "I don't expect anything," he added quickly. "Not forgiveness, not even conversation. But if there's anything you want someone to hear, I'll listen, and I'll carry it. Quietly, if that's what you want." Eleanor studied him, this man who had once been part of the wall that blocked her voice, and for a brief second, she saw past the polished shoes and careful words. She saw the ache of someone trying to rebuild something invisible, and she did what she had learned to do in moments like this. She opened the door not fully, just enough to let her words pass through. "It's not me who needs your listening," she said softly. "It's the others, the ones still writing without names, the ones who don't knock at doors." He nodded, once, deeply, respectfully. He didn't offer more words. He simply handed her the letter and turned away. The next day, he returned, quietly to the library, not to find her, but to leave something behind. A poem not his own, but copied carefully in his hand. It spoke of voices stitched into wind, of sentences carried on riverbanks, of echoes that outlast silence. He placed it in the tray, and Clara, now helping in the library each week, tucked it gently into the box with the others. That night, Eleanor sat beneath the old tree, Clara beside her, both of them wrapped in shawls as dusk crept in. "Do you think people ever really change?" Clara asked. Eleanor didn't answer right away. She watched the last light filter through the branches, remembered the gavel, the benches, the silence. "Sometimes," she said at last, "not all at once, and not loudly, but sometimes, yes. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor smiled. The years passed without ceremony. No one carved Eleanor's name into the history of the town. No statue, no portrait, no mention in official records. Her face faded from memory for most, like a name once spoken at the edge of conversation, never quite heard. But the tray in the library remained. It was moved once when renovations began, tucked into a quieter corner near the window, and yet it kept filling letters with no return addresses, poems written on tea-stained napkins, thoughts scribbled in margins, truths folded carefully and left behind. People no longer asked who had started it. Some believed it had always been there. Others said it was simply the way the town breathed, new in stories told without names. Eleanor continued to write, though her hands grew slower, her sight dimmer. She never tried to gather the letters again, never claimed authorship, never sought thanks. Her joy, if it could be called that, came from knowing the silence she had once been forced to live in had been repurposed into a place where others could gently unfold. Clara, now older, became the librarian's assistant. She straightened shelves, repaired bindings, read aloud to children who couldn't yet follow the lines with their eyes. And every now and then, she would sort through the tray. She didn't throw anything away. She filed each note in a wooden cabinet behind her desk, labeling them not with names, but with soft words: grief, hope, unfinished, brave. One spring, Eleanor didn't come to the tree. Clara waited. She came again the next day, and the next, carrying a folded paper, a story she wanted to share. But the bench beneath the tree remained empty. No letter arrived. No word. Clara knew. She walked to the cobbler's shop and asked softly. The owner nodded once, gently. Peaceful, he said, like falling asleep with a page still open. They held no funeral. Eleanor had outlived her name in the public world, but Clara did something else. She took the linen scrap Eleanor had once shown Hertha, one with the first words she was never allowed to say, and she framed it, not behind glass, not in a museum, just beside the library tray, beneath a hand-painted sign that read, "You are safe to speak here." Visitors often stopped to read it. Some asked about the handwriting. Clara never told them everything, but when someone looked at the linen, at the words stitched carefully into the threads, "I only wanted to be heard," they often grew quiet, as if hearing something that hadn't been spoken aloud. Over time, a small display grew around that scrap. More stitched words, more folded pages. A quiet kind of tribute to someone no one remembered by name, yet everyone seemed to understand. On clear mornings, Clara would open the windows, let the breeze move across the letters, and imagine the words lifting into the light. Not as protest, not as history, but as presence. Eleanor's voice never returned to a courtroom, but it returned. In the silence after someone read a line that sounded like their own pain. It returned in the ink-stained fingers of a girl, too shy to speak aloud. It returned in the trembling pen of a man who had never said "I'm sorry" until the day he found a poem about forgiveness. Her voice lived in pauses, in breath, in the stillness between sentences, and that, Clara came to believe, was more powerful than any gavel or verdict. Because a courtroom ends in judgment, but a quiet letter left behind without demand can begin again in anyone, even in you. And now, as you listen, you have heard her too. Not her name, perhaps, not the sound of her voice, but her truth, folded into the hush of paper, woven into silence, carried gently across time. That is how she lives, not through noise, but through being heard. Thank you for listening to this story on Her Silent Cry. If Eleanor's journey moved you, or reminded you of someone who was once silenced, please consider subscribing to the channel. Together, we bring forgotten voices back to life gently, one story at a time. May your night be soft, your sleep deep, and your dreams filled with voices finally heard.